the opportunity to be here. It's a great pleasure to be here and also to be part of such an awesome and distinguished lineup. What I'm going to be doing today, I'm not going to be arguing against a specific position, so I don't have objections to offer per se, nor do I seek to reject certain philosophical positions or metaphysical views. Instead, I'm here to present a way of thinking about physicalism that may appeal to those who are scientifically minded. And my hope ultimately is to expand the options for physicalists. And in doing so, bring contemporary work in the philosophy of science closer to work in contemporary metaphysics. And let me see, I can. So many of the ideas that I want to be talking about originate in a previous work that I did with my colleague Guy Dav and I. And in this book, we try to offer a revisionist account of physicalism and use that account to show how consciousness can fit within a physicalist framework. And I'm going to be doing something similar here in this talk. And I'll talk about ways of thinking about physicalism and thinking about how we can fit within scientific practice. So there's going to be a lot of the conversations that I've had with Guy Dav are going to be reflected in this talk, but it's just an ongoing project about how to figure out how to think about physicalism in different ways. And I will begin by talking about this position in philosophy of science. I call it new mechanism, but also proponents of this view call it new mechanism. And basically, new mechanism is a type of, it's more or less a consensus that has arisen within recent philosophy of science. And it basically says that, look, when you take a look at life sciences, and specifically neuroscience and certain areas in biology, the most common explanations that you find are explanations that describe mechanisms. So when you're trying to describe and explain a biological phenomenon or neuroscientific phenomenon, you're offering a description of mechanism. And now on the face of this, on the face of it, new mechanism is compatible with physicalism. And I'm going to mention a few reasons to think why the two go together. First, mechanisms don't just exist on their own independently of other things in the world. So if you offer a mechanism of a biological phenomenon, it stands in some kind of causal, perhaps constitutive or explanatory relationship to some other phenomena. So there are links there that seem to put everything together in some kind of order. New mechanisms, in fact, see themselves as explaining phenomena that are located in a web of connections that has a hierarchical has a ranking in some ways. You have one phenomenon and you explain it with something else, you give a mechanism of that phenomenon, and then maybe you're able to break down the mechanism in other mechanisms. And in addition to that, most of proponents of this view in the philosophy of science accept that no phenomenon is an exception to the laws of nature. So if you put these things together, it sounds like that what they're proponents of new mechanism, what they're doing is to engage in a kind of scientifically minded physicalism. However, there's a distance between the two positions, and the distance is important here. Much more is needed from the new mechanism or the new mechanists, the proponents of this view, to show that what you have here is a form of physicalism. So physicalists who want to be on board with this idea, who want to be new mechanists, owe us an answer to the question of whether mechanisms construct the world. And so what do I mean by this idea of construction here? Well, I'm borrowing this notion from Karen Bennett, discussion of constructing relationships or building relationships. So it's being mechanistically explained, a type of building relationship. And I want to get a little bit more precise here. Does the presence of mechanistic explanations determine what kind of relations can and cannot hold between explanand and explanand? So I've explained a phenomenon giving a mechanism. What is the relationship between the parts of the mechanisms and the higher level phenomenon that I have just explained? Or it might be even on the same level. Does a mechanistic explanation of psi, let's say, an activity, rule out the possibility of psi being strongly emergent? Or more generally, does a mechanistic explanation of psi in terms of its components guarantee that this phenomenon that I have just mechanistically explained is in some sense nothing over and above its components? And this last question, I think it's crucially important. It's a type of an obvious question to ask when you're examining new mechanism and mechanisms in general. But it is crucially important because it allows us to see how new mechanism is situated in regards to physicalism. So if mechanisms fail to render the explanandum nothing over and above its explanations, then even if the world were, and I'm allowing the exception of some basic physical components to be mechanistic through and through, right? I just have one mechanism on top of another, and I'm explaining everything in this nicely linked hierarchical way, physicalism will still not be a guarantee. Maybe at some point I get some strongly emergent phenomenon, for instance. I'm still giving a mechanistic explanation, but maybe I'm not holding onto physicalism anymore. And so with that question in mind as the background, that will be the background of this conversation, of this talk. And my aims here are to examine first the ontological commitments of new mechanism, and to argue that it is compatible, as it's just suggested, with physicalist views, but also, and more importantly for my purposes, with certain anti-physicalist conceptions of the world. And I think this is an easy point to show, and I'm not going to spend too much time. What's important is to indicate that if you want to be a physicalist and you're attracted to this approach within philosophy of science and scientific practice, then you're faced with a choice. And this is where I think things become more interesting. So if you're a proponent of this view, you can try to make new mechanism more metaphysically stringent. And what do I mean by that? Well, you can start adding metaphysical requirements that ought to be held in order for the phenomenon to be mechanistically explained. So you might want to say, well, I haven't given a mechanistic explanation if there is a sense in which the explanandum is over and above things that do the explaining. Or, and this is what I'm going to be suggesting as a new possible avenue, is to adopt a new form of physicalism that is friendly to mechanism by reconsidering basic and core assumptions of physicalism. And so basically, as I say, we have a choice here, and we might have more choices, but I'm simplifying things. In this fork in the road, we can continue business as usual and just do our metaphysics and try to put our metaphysics into scientific practice and see how far that will get us. So we'll be doing metaphysics for science, or we can rethink of physicalism through the filter of successful scientific practices. And this is what I'll be calling a new type of physicalism. And I'm going to qualify how new this is, which is not that new, but it is an idea of physicalism that is born out of successful scientific practice. Importantly, is not going to be dependent upon a didactic nomological model of explanation, as traditionally physicalism has been. It won't espouse theses of exceedingly strong model strength. In fact, we're going to try to eschew those theses of model strength, and that might be a problem, and a lot of people might reject this as a view of physicalism, but it's worth trying, in my opinion. And finally, we should add more to mechanisms or new mechanisms, so we are allowed to show, or we can or hope to show, that the presence of mechanisms gives you something close to physicalism. Okay, so that's the idea, that's the outcome that I was trying to accomplish in this talk. So let me return back to new mechanism and say a little bit more about what this position is and what does it mean to think about phenomena in terms of mechanism and to explain them. The first thing I want to mention is that this position doesn't guarantee physicalism. It's not sufficient for physicalism. And there's a simple reason, and that is because the presence of mechanistic explanations does not rule out anti-physicalist views. And especially the main competitor view here that's not ruled out immediately will be something like strongly emergent views. So if you think those views as being anti-physicalist in some ways, then new mechanism won't suffice to give you physicalism. And you can think about this in various ways, but think about this in terms of what questions remain unopened or unanswered, what kind of doubts you might have. So if you think that a mechanistic explanation of consciousness that bottoms out, it ends in non-conscious parts or components, we might think that's evidence to support physicalism. I've explained a phenomenon mechanistically. I explain consciousness by giving a non-conscious explanation of it. Or you might think I'm giving a mechanistic explanation of life or digestion, doesn't matter, any kind of biological phenomena. You might think that, well, if you've done that, then it should be evidence in support of non-vitalist positions. But if you're still wondering whether panpsychism or vitalism are true or not, after a mechanistic explanation of consciousness and life has been offered, then the presence of a mechanistic explanation seems to be leaving the ontology of the phenomenon undetermined. We have given you an explanation, but I haven't really quite shown that I've also dealt with what the ontology is. And so we might think, and a lot of people do think this, that the discovery of mechanisms is just the beginning and not the end of the ontological struggles of those who like mechanistic explanations and also at the same time want to be physicalists. And if you look into the literature of new mechanism, at least in the beginning of this literature, you will find cases in which it seems that how people are describing their views is pretty and straightforwardly compatible with certain anti-physicalist views. So if you look at a kind of a classical exposition of new mechanism in Karl Craver's work, he gives an account of what he calls constitutive mechanistic explanations. And I'm going to simplify matters a bit here, but if you have a component of phenomenon of a mechanism, that will be a constitutive part of S. If X is a part of S, if by manipulating S's behavior, you change or manipulated S's behavior, and if you manipulated S's behavior, you can change X's behavior, right? And you can offer that as a kind of a constitutive account, but those three conditions can be jointly met, but you don't have a guarantee that the mechanistically constituted phenomena is going to be nothing over and above its composing parts. Right? You can generate counterexamples here that show that you still have something that's not in line with physicalism. A second case, similar case, Carl Gillett has argued that if you look at many versions of new mechanism and not just the one that I consider right now, vitalism is still a life possibility. And so you consider something like you try to explain life by giving a mechanistic explanation, but at the end of the day, you're stuck with some uncomposed biological properties that do part of the explaining. In that case, you haven't really shown that vitalism is it's not a viable possibility. And I'm mentioning this, but I also want to add that this isn't just a theoretical worry that we might have. In the history of neuroscience, if you look at the debate between people who thought of the existence of animal spirits, vitalists, and then mechanists, people who rejected vitalism, you even find, this in the work of Robert Witt, and this consideration of why deep-brained frogs might return to a sitting position, an appeal to a vital force, what he called the sentient principle. And that was in fact a kind of a mechanistic explanation of this phenomena, but it was one that cannot be rendered consistent with physicalism. It wasn't biological in the sense that we're accounting for it now or we're explaining it now. It was just something that happens and I cannot further explain it. It was kind of making an allusion there to something like a soul or something else, something non-physical in some way. So this is a challenge here, and it's a main worry, how to specify the relationship between the target phenomenon and its component. What exactly is that relationship? And I think this challenge is something that everyone who is interested in this project of new mechanism has to face, because it arises from core claims of new mechanism. And so if you look at the mechanisms, I'm not going to go over these 3 commonly cited characteristics. If you have any familiarity with the literature, you probably read them 100 times already. So McCormick, Darter, and Graven give that in the 2000 paper, Glennon 2002, and Bechtel and Abrahamson in 2005. But then we can work with a kind of what is now known in the literature, kind of ecumenical definition, something broad enough that many people interested in the new mechanism can agree. And a mechanism for a phenomenon consists of entities and activities organized in such a way that they're responsible for the phenomenon. And so the question that I'm focusing on here is, what do we mean by being responsible for this phenomenon? And is there a way of expressing this being responsible in a way that's acceptable by proponents of physicalism? This ecumenical definition is broad and glosses over many of the controversies that will vex and continue to vex new mechanists. However, it highlights core elements of mechanistic explanation. We have a phenomenon. We have entities and activities that are supposed to explain this phenomenon in virtue of their organization. And so the classical diagram here is you're explaining SS psi in terms of the different x1 phi, x2 phi, x3 phi. You have all those things doing something organized together in the right way, and that gives you an explanation of the phenomenon. So the higher level phenomenon is explained in terms of the relevant entities, their activities, and the organization of those elements. So that's how it's supposed to work. Now, let me make 3 notes here, which are important for our discussion. And I'm keeping the figure there, so it might help comprehension. Now, it's not required by the mandates of mechanism that the constituents of this phenomenon that I'm trying to explain are necessarily physicalistically acceptable. And what I mean by that, and this is what I had in mind when I was explaining about kind of the vitalism. You can have a biological phenomenon that you can explain in this way, but you're appealing to some kind of components that it's hard for you to make sense how they belong into a physicalist conception. There might be uncomposed, you just have difficulty understanding how they work and how they fit with the rest of the world. There's no guarantee, number 2, that mechanisms that are offered at different levels integrate fully and bottom out in the physical. Maybe you have different levels of reality that they just don't connect or click together. Maybe there's no bottoming out in the physical. Maybe everything bottoms out in the chemical. Is that a problem for physicalism? Those are open questions. Third, mechanistic explanations, as I've been mentioned and repeated a few times, should be supplemented by an account of constitution that illustrates how higher level phenomenon, the S psi, is nothing over and above its constituents and its activities. Without having that, then it is an open question whether not only whether we have explained it, we might say you have explained it this way, but have you shown what its ontological character really is? And at this point, you might say, well, does it matter that new mechanism leaves those questions unanswered? And in fact, many, a few, I don't know what the number would be, proponents of new mechanism welcome this fact. And they just say, look, although our position is consistent with physicalism, it doesn't entail it. And so that might allow us to have a kind of a different metaphysical view, kind of ontological pluralism in some robust sense. Now, at the same time, all the same, if you are a committed physicalist and you like this model of explanation in scientific practice, then you need to do additional work. It's not sufficient to you for you to say, well, those are the questions there, and I'm just not addressing them. And so I'm going to appeal to this notion or this idea of new physicalism. I want to explain exactly what I mean by new physicalism in a bit, and that will be a way of addressing this issue for the new mechanists. But before I go to new physicalism, I should talk about traditional, old, good-fashioned physicalism. I want to give a very brief description here. Physicalism is the view that what really exists in our world is just the physical. So I underline really and just because I think they do a lot of work in that description of physicalism. And I'm going to translate that sentence. we can say that there's certain things or some things, this might be objects, properties, events, states of affairs, that are talking in our world and are fundamentally physical. And we fix this fundamentality perhaps because they're postulated in our best physical science. And then anything that is talking in our world and which is not fundamentally physical turns out to be derivatively physical, insofar as it's nothing over and above some other thing that is both fundamentally physical and talking in our world. So quick example, we might have I'm looking at a door in front of me. We might say that a door is not a fundamentally physical thing, but it is derivatively physical because it is nothing over and above a bunch of other things that are fundamentally physical and actually exist in our world. And then you might want to add that no thing that is talking in our world is such that it's neither fundamentally nor derivatively physical. And that gives you close to what we might mean by physicalism. And we can figure out the details later if we need to. One of the attractions of physicalism, and this is a personal attraction, a reason why often I think something like physicalism makes sense, is that it allows us to think about two claims at the same time and as a way of combining them. So you might have this idea of plurality, that look, the world contains a lot of things. And in fact, it contains much more things than what physics or textbooks tell us exist. And at the same time, you might want to say, well, everything that exists is kind of of the same kind. Physicalism is a way of having plurality and austerity, of having both of them or putting them together. And this is the connection I was getting at with the derivatively physical and the fundamentally physical. So let's let X be a derivatively physical property or an entity, and Y a set of fundamentally physical properties. I'm just going to restrict my attention to properties right now. And then we want to ask, what is the relationship R, such that if X, R, Y is true, then X is rendered nothing over and above Y. So this is, I take to be, one of the most pressing questions of physicalism, figuring out what that R is. But given what I said about new mechanism before, you can easily see that this is a pressing question for new mechanisms or new mechanists as well. And so if you want to be a physicalist new mechanist, you have options here again. And this is kind of the business as usual option. You can say, well, what is the R that does work for my mechanisms and also renders the phenomenon that I'm explaining physical? Well, maybe it is something that has been given in the literature. So it might be, so they can hold that the presence of a mechanistic explanation entails that the higher order phenomenon supervenes on, is necessitated by, existentially depends on, is realized by, or is grounded by its components and its activity. You can choose whatever metaphysical relationship physicalists have used in the past and just plug it in to the mechanistic literature. And this is, I'm going to call it old physicalism. So it's kind of mechanism combined with physicalism. I'm not going to criticize this. I think it's certainly a possibility. I do have some worries that I want to mention, but those are not meant to be necessarily objections to it. Just we might need to do more work to make this work. So on the one hand, if you appeal to something like supervenience, necessitation, or existential dependence, we might need to say more. And what I mean by we might need to say more is that there are views out there that those relationships cannot solve, might still be compatible better with anti-physicalism, for example, a strong type of emergentism. And if it is, then you haven't really shown how these R renders the derivatively physical, nothing over and above the fundamentally physical. Right? And I know people who object in this way to those kinds of varieties of physicalism. And then there are, of course, people who want to defend them. On the other hand, and this might bother more the people who take the new mechanists seriously, if you look at varieties of realization of grounding that could perhaps do the necessary metaphysical work, that is to say, exclude anti-physicalism, well, they're not scientifically motivated or grounded. So it's not like you're looking into what science is doing and then you're doing metaphysics within science. You have your metaphysical conception and you try to impose it on scientific practice. At the same time, you might also worry that they're embracing models of explanations that just don't work with new mechanisms. So there are ways of treating grounding as a type of explanation in a way, and then applying this to physicalism. But you might think that this is not what I want to do if I'm really committed to new mechanism. So back to this question, what is the relationship R such that if X, R, Y is true, then X is rendered nothing over and above Y. And I said one way of dealing with the R is to look at the literature on physicalism. There's another option here. And then physicalist new mechanists can look not to the physicalist literature, but to the new mechanist literature. And I mentioned Craver's account of Constitution, but there are many others' account of Constitution as well. There's another, and you can do that. There's a different move here that you can do. But I'm going to raise a general worry. Again, not necessarily an objection, but something that should concern us if we choose this way of proceeding. And the worry here is whether you're going to get physicalism as it has been traditionally conceived. Remember, one of the ideas that I'm pushing is that R is a metaphysical relationship. If it holds, it guarantees the presence of Y guarantees the presence of X. The fundamentally physical guarantees the presence of the derivatively physical. But what is exactly the nature of this guarantee? Is it a matter of logical, metaphysical, or nomological necessity? And I think if you're really committed to new mechanism, you're going to give us a nomological guarantee. You're going to say something, given the laws of nature, the presence of a mechanism's components and their activities together, this presence guarantees the presence of the mechanism and the phenomenon that you're trying to explain. A lot of people are going to object to this. Traditionally, at least, you might say that this type of nomological necessity, it's inadequate to capture the character of physicalism. We need something stronger to get physicalism in addition to this nomological necessity. I say this is a worry, but I am, although both sympathetic to the worry, I think there's a way of dealing with this worry. We just need to rethink our conception of physicalism a little bit. And if we change that, maybe we can solve this worry. And so here's my kind of preliminary upshot halfway into the talk. I mentioned these problems, these two strategies, not to rule out the possibility of a new mechanism that's consistent with old or traditional physicalism. But my aim is to make room for a different understanding of physicalism. And I think we should at least be open to the possibility of exploring this physicalism and seeing whether and how whether we're can succeed and how far it can take us. So my first conclusion is this is good news. Let's celebrate this. It's a possibility of something else, something new. So this is what I'm calling new physicalism. It's a type of physicalism that's going to focus on explanation. It's going to be motivated by successful scientific practice. And it's going to be metaphysics light, but perhaps it's going to be ontology heavy. It's going to have a lot of onto-commitments. You can't get around those. You try to relax your metaphysical commitments, however. So what is this physicalism? I'm gonna explain it in a little bit more detail, but now it's going to be an explanatory project. The heart of physicalism is a project of explanation, and it is to explain all natural phenomena that are relevant to our understanding of our place in nature. And kind of the litmus test here will be consciousness. Can I offer an explanation of consciousness or not? If it cannot explain consciousness, then it doesn't work. It's not true, but I don't want to use the word true. It's not going to be a successful project. And I want to return back to this idea, distinction between being true and being successful. So if that's the new physicalism, why am I calling it new physicalism? Well, because an old physicalism, it kind of does focus on metaphysics. It is motivated often by moral and logical considerations, and it is built to withstand anti-physicalist arguments. We want to have this kind of resistance to anti-physicalist arguments, and that's how a lot of the debates, contemporary debates in the metaphysics of consciousness are playing out. You have the anti-physicalist argument, you have to patch up your physicalism or respond to physicalism in various ways. And lastly, I think old physicalism is still beholden by this traditional and I think outdated model of explanation, the didactic nomological model. And if you think of accounts of physicalism as a priori entailment. That's kind of the didactic nomological model in different terms. I'm calling it new, but it's certainly not brand new in any stretch of the imagination. If you look in the literature of physicalism, so Bas van Fraassen, Jeffrey Pollan, and Lisa Ney call physicalism or argue that physicalism is not a metaphysical thesis first and foremost. It's something else, perhaps it's an attitude or something else. Barbara Montero takes a metaphysics light approach, and I'm very sympathetic to that way of thinking. Churchland, Patricia Churchland calls for a coevolutionary approach, and she calls physicalism a highly probable, or that should be probable hypothesis. And Dasgupta, in his grounding paper, does work to show that physicalism should be understood as an explanatory program in some way, but it involves grounding. So there are a lot of similarities and dissimilarities with a lot of position that exists already in the literature. And so in this view, this type of physicalism, I take it that it should fit with how psychological and brain sciences work and how they're trying to be integrated together. It should be compatible with theoretical upheaval. So new discoveries are going to happen. It shouldn't be so easily, it shouldn't be that brittle that if something changes, then we have to give it up. But of course, and I think this is the most important part of it, we should leave open the possibility of failure. Things might turn out in a way that we wanted to say, we want to reflect and say, well, look, this failed. This wasn't the right approach after all. In the same way that we're looking at the history of neuroscience and the history of biology and saying, well, vitalism wasn't the right approach. Many of us at least think that. Having this knowledge now, we can look back and make that claim. And I'm calling this, and we did that in the book, called this kind of a research program, Physicalism. What does that mean? Physicalism is an interdisciplinary program that aims to offer compositional explanations for all natural phenomena that are central in our understanding of our place in nature. Okay, let me explain this a little bit more. It's interdisciplinary because it seeks to integrate the physical sciences, the life sciences, and even elements of philosophy. So there are going to be philosophical concepts that are going to be crucially important for this project as well. It's a research program because it consists of a network of people working in this program, involves theoretical claims and methodological principles, and it aims to establish its aim, and that is to offer a compositional explanation of the phenomena that are of interest to us. And so I mentioned this word a few times, compositional explanations. Why I think that composition will work? Well, again, it's it's ubiquitous in, if you open biological or life science textbooks, most explanations are compositional. It respects higher level causal powers without making them mysterious. And I'm going to give an example that aims to illustrate this. It has a commitment to physics and anchors higher level phenomena to lower level phenomena. There's no gaps between the levels if you are able to nest the composition in the right way. I have physics with an asterisk there because it turns out that if you look at physics, there might be different notions of composition at play. And I'll just bracket that very difficult issue for now. And it is successful. We've been using it for hundreds of years and it offers clear understanding. But let me give a little bit more detail about what I mean by compositional explanation. I want to give two quick examples, and I'm not expert in either of those examples, but if you look at the textbooks, you can get enough information to see how the compositional explanation can work. So first we can look at immunity, and you might say immunity general is resistance to disease, and we have an immune system, which is a collection of cells, tissues, molecules that mediate and work towards this resistance to infections, help us resist infections. And then we might have the activity here that will be the response, and it's the coordinate reactions of cells and molecules to infectious microbes. And so this is standard diagrams from a textbook, and you might talk about innate immunity and adaptive immunity, and then to the right side, you'll have the adaptive immunity. And so you have the different types of microbes, then you have the different types of lymphocytes, they work in different ways, and then they have a different function. But you break down everything into distinct parts, and you see how they all fit together. So the immune system and its activities can be compositionally explained. So for example, aspects of the adaptive immune system are explained in terms of the workings of the lymphocytes, which are taken to be components of adaptive immunity, and then the various properties of the lymphocytes are explained in other lower level entities, etc. The other example I'm going to pass over quickly, but where many of us are familiar with this, is trying to explain graphite. And then you look at the composition of graphite. You look at the carbon atoms, how they're bonded together to other carbon atoms. And then if you look to the diagram there, you see all those interconnected hexagonal rings. And given their composition and the forces and the way they're put together, you can explain a bunch of properties. And then you can also look at graphite not just as hexagonal, but as kind of planes. And there's a different connection between the planes, and we know that the bond between those planes is much weaker than the bond holding each of the carbon atoms in the hexagonal rings. And so this allows us to explain something like writing using a pencil. Right? Why does it leave a mark? Because, well, the slides, those layers slide off nicely. And so we have a compositional explanation of writing with a pencil. And this is a very successful explanation. It makes a lot of sense, and it renders a lot of things transparent in some way. All right, so that's what I mean by compositional explanation, kind of quickly by giving those examples. Let me I want to conclude by making 2 points here. One is to bring the differences into focus of new physicalism versus old physicalism, and then show how we can perhaps solve that problem that I began with, the new mechanism. So number one difference, old physicalism will conceive of physicalism in terms of moral commitments, right? You might say, if physicalism is true in this world, then any world that is physically indistinguishable to our world, or minimally physically indistinguishable to our world, must also be indistinguishable in all other respects. The research program idea doesn't make any claims of that sort. It's instead a position about our world. It holds that our world is a physicalist world if all derivatively physical phenomena can be ultimately shown to be composed of fundamental physical parts, and you give a compositional explanation. Second difference. Unlike old physicalism, the research program physicalism is not really a thesis, it is a research program. And what does that mean? Well, I mean, it will espouse certain theses, but you cannot say that it's either true or false, the whole thing. You can describe it as either being successful or unsuccessful. And so it will be successful if we decide that a compositional explanation of, let's say, consciousness, actually, it will be unsuccessful if we decide that the compositional explanation of consciousness is not forthcoming. It will be successful if we have explained all phenomena of interest in a compositional manner. So there are going to be success conditions and failure conditions instead of truth and falsity conditions. And lastly, the 2 types of physicalism are going to be motivated by different sets of considerations. Whereas old physicalism is moved by moral and logical considerations, and I said it's built to withstand anti-physical arguments, new physicalism is not. So traditional anti-physicalist arguments, like the zombie argument, for instance, will hold little sway over it. It's going to be instead guided by successful scientific practice, and it will be concerned with whether it's getting that practice correctly or not. So this is the last point, to penultimate point. One worry that a lot of people might have when I present and when I talk about this research program is whether this new physicalism is physicalist. Right? I might just be using the word, but not really defending the view that it's physicalist. And my response is to say, why not? And not only are compositional explanations almost ubiquitous in science, I think they're exemplary of how one phenomenon is explained in virtue of another, and in fact, without remainder. So when we explain graphite and the properties of graphite using its composition, that's a great explanation. Right? I can explain why it has certain macro level properties in a pretty transparent and robust way. And so successful compositional explanations leave no questions unanswered. They might leave metaphysical questions unanswered, but those are not the questions that the research program is going to focus on. Now, and this is not because I have somehow deduced or I'm able to deduce a priori the target phenomenon using statements involving components and perhaps certain bridging principles. I think this is not part of what science is doing. So if you want to be take seriously scientific practice, we might want to restructure, rethink how physicalism ought to be framed. So compositional explanations explain not because of a priori deductions or the presence of entailment thesis, but because when they lay bare the compositional nature of a phenomenon, they render intelligible the target phenomena. And so ultimately such explanations show that nature is order and that everything fits together nicely. Another way of putting this is to say that physicalists, and I find this a very useful way, physicalists describe their project as one of finding a place for a non-physical phenomena, be it social, biological, economic, mental, etc., in the physical world. And so physicalism succeeds when all phenomena are kind of feeded in the physical world. You have found a place for them. And I think compositional explanations have the power of doing precisely that, by showing how all phenomena are composed of physical entities that place them in the natural world order. So new physicalism, we think of it as research program physicalism, and there's nothing physically untoward with new physicalism. It doesn't posit spooky existence. It doesn't leave room for nomological danglers if you get your explanations to fit nicely together. It is hierarchical and it privileges the physical if you demand that it bottoms out on the physical. It tackles the various location problems that physicalists had always sought to solve. And even if they're stronger or more super duper varieties of physicalism, I think that new physicalism is physicalism enough. I have more to say, but I'm going to stop here because I think I've said enough to motivate this idea, hopefully. And thank you for your patience. And I look forward to your questions.